Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to lead your series of Lenten Bible studies. So I need to begin by saying that I'm really sorry that I am not there with you in person, or that I am not on screen with you in person, but that I've recorded these in advance because I've been called away to do something else that wasn't on the cards when I agreed to do this 18 months ago. I'm no less committed to doing this, however. I'd like to say, second, that all of these Bible studies are not so much about the theme of water in the Bible, but about the things that come, well, not that come with the water, but that the water comes with or in. This is a series of Bible studies around the places where the water is to be found. That could be wells or cisterns or rivers, but we're not so much thinking about the water as the life of the community and the spiritual life that is reflected when the places that water is to be found are spoken about. And the third thing that I'd like to say is that when I do a Bible study in person with people, I often use little wooden figures. I am not godly play trained, but I find it really helpful to put the little people out and say, where are the people in this story who got there first? Who owns this space? Are the people inside or outside? How do the dynamics of the story works? I'm not expecting that you have your own set of little wooden people, but it might be that you've got something like some buttons or something like that available, and that you could use those if you wanted to look at some of the dynamics of the story by moving those around your tabletop yourself. I'm now going to screen share. Always a slightly anxious moment. This is a picture taken in the northeast. It's a picture that I'm really pleased with. The reason I'm using it for this series is because it has a lot of water in it, but we're looking through that and through to see what the lighthouse, the message, the light, the heart, the guidance is within any of these passages. And the passages that we are going to look at today are both around the theme of wrongs and rights, looking at the idea through a couple of Bible passages of how we stand for justice and how easy or difficult that is for people and those around them sometimes as they do that. And the first passage that we look at is Genesis 37, verses 14 to 35. And I will read that because we're recording and that's just easier. This is a story of something that happened to Joseph. And it's quite a familiar story to any of us who have grown up singing Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoats. And because we are familiar with Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoats, I think we tend to think it's a children's story and it's very jolly and it's got all these jolly songs in it and these brothers are all quite characters, and then you have the Midianites, hairy crew came riding by and all the rest of it. But actually, looked at from an adult perspective, this is a deeply serious story. Joseph himself, like so many of these Old Testament patriarchs, is a character with some good in him and some less good in him. And he has got himself to this position by being really quite a pain in the neck in the life of his family. Much loved and much favoured by his father, but that's caused a lot of problems in the relationships around him. And so we're reading from Genesis 37 and verse 17. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the cisterns. Then we can say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we can see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard of it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Well, let's not take his life. Shed no blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might come back later and rescue him out of their hand and restore him to their father." So when Joseph arrived with his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camel caravan carrying gum, balm, and resin on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. For he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. So when some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifted him out of the cistern, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Jacob to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit, and he saw that Joseph was not in the cistern, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, "This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." And thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. If we were laying this story out with our little people, we would need quite a few of them. I think from memory that there are 10 brothers present. Benjamin, brother, is still at home with the family. And Joseph is on this journey in order to meet with his different brothers. He's been sent down by his father. If we lay out the pieces, you feel as though you should be putting Joseph into a little community of his brothers. But in fact, his brothers are very antagonistic. And if we lay them out, I think I would have the one over here and the other brothers over here. Other brothers, there you are. See them a little. You can see them a little bit better. But out of this group of brothers in the story, it turns out that we have to pull 2 brothers. And if you lay these pieces out, it's really interesting to see where you put them. Do we assume that Judah's and Reuben's speaking out against the plan are the same sort of speaking out and come from the same place? Do we put these 2 brothers together, shoulder to shoulder? Or do we take one brother out first and the other brother out second, and maybe take this brother to a different place? If you lay out your pieces like that, it can be quite interesting to see where you think that you have been this person excluded from this group of people, or where you see that happening. Or to think about where you might have been one of these people, peeling out from the rest and trying to find a way of making a stand. I'm now going to stop screen sharing. so that I can see my notes and talk to you better. I think that we should also then look at our second story. I'm going to screen share again. I shouldn't have stopped. I'm going to look at our second story, and it's a story from the book of Jeremiah. It's a very similar story in that, like the story of Joseph, it's a story centered around systems. We find it in Jeremiah chapter 38 and starting from the top of the chapter. Now, Shephatiah, son of Mattan, Gedaliah, son of Pashur, Jukal, son of Shelemiah, and Pashur, son of Malchiah, heard the words that Jeremiah was saying to all the people. Thus says the Lord, those who stay in this city shall die by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence. But those who go out to the Chaldeans shall live. They shall have their lives as a prize of war, but live. Thus says the Lord, the city will surely be handed over to the army of the king of Babylon and be taken. And the official said to the king, this man ought to be put to death, because he is discouraging the soldiers who are left in the city and all the people by speaking such words to them. For this man is not seeking the welfare of the people, but their harm. King Zedekiah said, here he is in your hands, for the king is powerless against you. So they took Jeremiah and they threw him into the cistern of Malchiah the king's son, which was in the court of the guard, letting Jeremiah down by ropes. Now, there was no water in the cistern, but only mud, and Jeremiah sank in the mud. Ebed-melech, the Ethiopian, a eunuch in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah into the cistern. The king happened to be sitting at the Benjamin gate. So Ebed-melech left the king's house and spoke to the king. My lord king, these men have acted wickedly in all they did to the prophet Jeremiah by throwing him into the cistern to die there of hunger. For there is no bread left in the city. Then the king commanded Ebed-melech the Ethiopian, take 3 men with you from here and pull the prophet Jeremiah up from the cistern before he dies. So Ebed-melech took the men with him and went to the house of the king, to a wardrobe of the storehouse, and took from there old rags and worn-out clothes, which he let down to Jeremiah in the cistern by ropes. Then Ebed-melech the Ethiopian said to Jeremiah, just put the rags and clothes between your armpits and the ropes. And Jeremiah did so. Then they drew Jeremiah up by the ropes and pulled him out of the cistern. And Jeremiah remained in the court of the guard. King Zedekiah sent for the prophet Jeremiah and received him at the 3rd entrance of the temple of the Lord. The king said to Jeremiah, I have something to ask you. Do not hide anything from me. And Jeremiah said to Zedekiah, if I tell you, you will put me to death, will you not? And if I give you advice, you will not listen to me. So King Zedekiah swore an oath in secret to Jeremiah. As the Lord lives, who gave us our lives, I will not put you to death or hand you over to the men who seek your life. Then Jeremiah said to Zedekiah, thus says the Lord, the God of hosts, the God of Israel, if you will only surrender to the officials of the king of Babylon, then your life shall be spared, and this city shall not be burned with fire, and you and your house shall live. But if you do not surrender to the officials of the king of Babylon, then this city will be handed over to the Chaldeans, and they will burn it with fire, and you yourself shall not escape from their hand. And King Zedekiah said to Jeremiah, I am afraid. If we take our little wooden people again, and we think about the dynamics of this story, for me, they create another interesting picture. We have the king, who shilly-shallies quite a lot, doesn't he? Perhaps not having a little wooden person like this, but one of those things that you used to put in budgie's cages, that when the budgie pecked at it, it came down and then came up again. Not because he's resilient, but because he goes one way and the other. He doesn't know how to resist the voices of the different constituencies and the powerful people around him. And he's very much swayed by the powerful people rather than his autonomy and integrity as king, as God's appointed king. That doesn't seem to be the thing which holds most sway with him. And then we have this little group of people who, if you like, pretty well surround the king and hem him in with their voices and their opinions. And then we have Ebed-Melech. I wonder where you would put him as you put the pieces around the board. I think that I would put Ebed-Melech outside the situation completely. Ebed-Melech, it tells us, is not a Hebrew, he's not Jewish, he's not part of this. There is a Polish proverb, which I think I may have learned wrongly, and I certainly haven't learned it in Polish. But the proverb, the saying is, not my monkeys, not my zoo. And it's really a really quite comical way of being able to say, I'm walking away from this. I'm not having anything to do with it. It's not my problem. Ebed-Melech is a Cushite. He's an Ethiopian. He is not part of this problem. He could go back to his own country. But he wants not just to stay there, but even though he is an outsider in the situation, it's not his monkeys, it's not his zoo, he is the person who wants to intervene and make sure that right is done. And I suppose we could say that although he is the foreigner, the outsider, he's the person through whom good or God works. But what's also interesting, getting more pieces out of my little bag here, is that once he decides to do right, a whole load of other people come along. Their little heads above my hand, yes, that's it. A whole load of other people come along to help. So this Ebed-Melech, although he is the dissonant voice, and he is the person to speak out, and he speaks out against the powerful people, even though it's not his problem, and even though he's the outsider, it turns out that a whole load of other people want to align themselves with him and do right. I think that that is quite an interesting picture. So, for me, this story almost needs to come with a trigger alert. I don't know if you have had sort of personal acquaintance with the concept of a water storage cistern, but in our old house, we had one under the patio, and we didn't know about it until we were doing a bit of building work at the back of our house, and the workmen dug up the patio as it was, and they found this enormous cistern. And I found it absolutely terrifying, and it woke me up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night, because it was to me, such a frightening space. It was the shape of a milk bottle, but the milk bottle was under the ground. And if the children who were quite little had fallen in it, because of the way that the neck curves in, there would be absolutely no way that you could get out. So for me, both of these stories talk about cisterns. The Genesis story refers to them as a pit, but in other versions it's referred to as a cistern. For me, just talking about putting somebody in a cistern is a really terrifying place to start. Both of these stories are about people being put in these terrifying places. But I like these two stories because they also seem to me to have a common theme about what it is that we do when we see bad things happening. And in particular, how the confines of our situation and our context might or might not impact on what we do. And also how our human attempts to get it right can go very right, or they can leave us wondering whether we should have done something else, or indeed wondering whether we'd have been better if we'd not done anything at all. We start with a story of glowing rightness. We'll look at the Jeremiah story first. Until a couple of years ago, this story was largely unfamiliar to me. And at first sight, it's a typical Jeremiah sort of story. Jeremiah speaks out in a fairly miserable way, quite extensively. Help comes, and Jeremiah gets in trouble for it. Help comes, and what does Jeremiah do? He goes back to talking out correctly, but in a fairly miserable way again. Maybe there's a difference here in telling people what they want to hear and telling people what they don't want to hear, but in a way that would enable them to hear it. For all his merits, Jeremiah appears to have almost the opposite of the gift of the gab, really. He's got the gift of upsetting people with God's message rather than working out how he can give it in a way that will make them hear it and make them act. Actually, it's an interesting story set so many years ago, but not irrelevant to our days. You have a weak national leader who doesn't really know how to run the country in their season of power. And that means that this person becomes prey to lobbyists and powerful interests groups. And in the end, that means that bad decisions are made which don't allow his country to move forward. Now, people sometimes say that we shouldn't do politics in church. We had a row recently when it was Climate Sunday about what it was appropriate for us to say about the degradation of the climate in a Sunday service where it touched on what people might do about it. But in essence, this is a very political story. Essentially, it's about leaders being talked out of what is of God and delivering what is not. Of course, the trouble for us is that we are not Jeremiah. We don't have Jeremiah's status and we don't have Jeremiah's inspiration. So if we want to speak out, we can't do it with that authority that Jeremiah has, knowing that he is God's appointed prophet and being recognized as God's appointed prophet. When we speak out in these situations, we are compromised or conflicted because we live with contradictory convictions, we don't all agree, and they are very much our working out of what God's message is, not, as in Jeremiah's case, a message which has come from God. What I had always failed to recognise in this story is the nature of the quiet hero who comes to Jeremiah's rescue. I read from the NRSV today, and in the NRSV it's quite clear that Ebed-Melech is an Ethiopian. He is an African. But I'm used to reading versions of the Bible which describe Ebed-Melech as a Cushite. And the Bible is so full of nationalities that I've never heard of, Cushites, Amalekites, Moabites, Canaanites, that I've never really bothered to sort them out. I've never really realised that they were relevant. So it brings me up with a start to realise that Ebed-Melech as a Cushite is an Ethiopian. The hero of this story is a black guy and a foreigner. And I really think it helps us to look back at the scriptures and note the different ethnicities of the characters who are there and the different roles that they play. One of the well stories that we could have looked at is the story of Moses's marriage and Moses's bride. There are two different traditions about Moses's wife, but one tradition is very much that she also is a black woman. And that's something which we don't really dig into and remember. So in this story, the hero is an Ethiopian, and true for all of us, he's an outsider, he's a foreigner. I don't know what the social politics of the time were around the status of black people in the court of the king, but clearly Ebed-Melech is a person of status because he can approach the king and he can have his ear. He can get in to speak to him behind the backs of those four very powerful people. He is close to the king. I don't know how important being black in his story is in his story, but I can imagine that being a foreigner or an outsider makes him more exposed when he speaks out. Well, I suppose this story tells me that vulnerability is no excuse for staying quiet. Ebed-Melech is not quiet. He doesn't go stealthily to do good. He's able to harness considerable support, and he takes very tender care of Jeremiah. The description of how he gets him out of the well, him going and finding cloths and shouting down to Jeremiah, put the cloths under your armpits so the ropes won't hurt you. All of that in Jeremiah's terrifying situation, half buried in the mud, makes him a very heroic and moving character, I think. But then suddenly these 30 people also come out of the woodwork. They are willing to come and help, and to help all. And it reminds me that sometimes when we feel that we are the only person who's going to stand up and say anything about this, that sometimes when we do that, lots more people come out and stand with us. I'm always struck in the story of the Tolpuddle martyrs, when to support their release, 800,000 people signed a petition to Parliament. At that time, the population of mainland Britain was probably about 16 million. This is before the days of gov.org.change.whatever UK. And there's no social media, and there's no press, and there's limited press, limited reading, and limited no telly and things like that. So the fact that the news got out there is miracle enough. But the fact that then 800, nearly 1 million people, nearly 1 in 20 people signed a petition to say we want this changing. We know that the majority is not always right. But it's amazing how many people want to do right, but need somebody to put their head above the parapet first. I sometimes tell a story that was very distressing to me at the time. I'd come out of work when I was working in the Methodist Connectional offices in Marylebone, and I was going towards Paddington Station. And that means that you walk along a small side street, which is called Chapel Street, but which links the Marylebone Road with the Edgware Road. So it's a pretty busy side street. And as I was walking along on my side of the road, suddenly a situation with 2 men and 1 other man developed into a violent situation. And these 2 blokes started beating up this one guy and had him on the floor and were kicking him. And I think it was my rather foolish school teacher background that said, oh, there's a fight, I better go and do something about it. So I took my full 5'2.5" and I went up and started shouting at these men and telling them that they had to stop. And the reason I did that was because when I'd got there, I wasn't sure what else to do. So I decided I'd just shout at them. What happened then was really interesting. Although one 5'2.5" woman was shouting at these 2 blokes, suddenly the 30 people who were standing at the bus stop on the other side of the road all began to join in and help. And people who were parked along here got out of their cars and began to help. It's amazing how many people want to do right, but don't really know how to do it and need someone to put their head above the parapet first. And talking about politics, I learned this phrase recently from Sam Wells. Politics begins when one realizes that there is plenty that one can do. Discipleship begins when one realizes that what one must do is what Jesus did. So that's been true in my life. But the other story is also true in my life. A story of people trying, but in a more compromised way. Trying and it not turning out as well as you might have hoped. In fact, trying, but causing yet more grief and anxiety for the other and for yourself. Trying and being seen as the baddie when you were really trying to align yourself on the side of the angels and do the best you could in that situation. The best model in the Bible and in peace studies is that if you have a disagreement, you should sit down with the person and have it out. About that. When I was on the little road leading towards the Edgware Road, sitting down and having it out with the person wasn't something that was going to happen. And I have to say that situation after it, I was really in shock and very frightened about what could have happened that didn't happen, but that I hadn't really thought about before I let anything happen. And I went into Marks and Spencer's on the corner of the Edgware Road. And because when you're pregnant, they always say if your water's break in town, go to Marks and Spencer's because they have really good first aiders. So I went into Marks and Spencer's and I sat down in their little cafe and I sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. And I'm not much of a crier. And I went through paper hanky, those very thin ones that they have on the table, getting out one little paper towel and another little paper towel. And I went through a stack of these things. So I'm not sure that sitting down and having it out in a situation where I would be quite right to be a bit afraid is really the easiest or best or most possible thing to do. So I don't know about you, but I have quite a degree of sympathy with Reuben here. Reuben, if you remember, faced with his brother's bloodlust, says, I know, why don't we just stick him in a hole in the ground instead? Stick him in the cistern instead. Reuben is famous for 3,500 years for trying, but does he try hard enough? Should he have confronted the brothers? What should he have done? And what do you do when you're caught on the hop, when all of a sudden a bad thing's happening and it's like blown from almost nowhere? And what do you do then? But I'm also quite interested in the story, not just of Reuben, but the story of Judah. I've always thought that Reuben was the one who was trying and Judah was quite venal and money grubbing. Look, we've got this boy here to sell. We've got this boy here that we could kill. Why don't we just sell him instead? When actually it's not Reuben's good intentions, but it is Judah's compromised actions that actually get Joseph out of the cistern. I grew up on Joseph in his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. So for this story, it's actually an almost comedic contrast here of goodies and baddies, right and wrongs. But in reality, the story is not that simple. But I think that's a good reminder that actually in life, in reality, life isn't that simple either. What people really need to do is to speak out with confidence and act with clarity. But in this 3,500 year story, that 3,500 year old story, we see that the dilemmas that we have are nothing new. And history might judge us and get us wrong or get us right too. So, here are some questions which might help in your discussion. And I've headed this by invitation. And the first thing to do is just talk about what questions these stories bring up for you. What stories you want to tell because you have heard these stories. What reflections you have. And you don't need to say anything at all. But by invitation, here are some pointers to things that you might want to talk about and consider. What stands out for you in the differing responses of Reuben and Judah and Ebed-Melech? In both of these stories, there's a lot of other people around. Put yourself in their shoes. What's going on in their heads? And does any of that resonate with you? Sometimes we are suddenly and unexpectedly thrown into a situation where we are challenged to do the right thing. You might want to talk about a situation you've been in like that. If you don't want to talk about the situation, you might think about what you have learned from being in that situation. And that raises that further question of, given that so many of the challenging, what do I do situations come upon us suddenly, then are there ways that we can prepare for life's sudden moral and justice challenges? In many of these stories, like many of the stories of the patriarchs, there are few people who are wholly good or wholly bad. How do you see our God at work here? And where do you see similar in our international life or in your local context today? Somebody said to me recently, a Christian should do the right thing, whatever the cost. Discuss that. And can you do right by doing wrong, or do wrong by doing right? I'll leave you to talk about these things, and then Englesea Brook people to manage your conversation groups or whole, and to bring this together at the end. Thank you for being with me, and I shall see you another time.